Hey, welcome back to Things with Shrinks and Mental Health Zoomcast, where therapists share information on various topics and explore what's actually on the minds of Dartmouth students. We are your hosts. I'm Paris Palmer.
And I'm Alex Lenzen. And today we'll be talking about sex and hookup culture, which makes me think about the Salt and Pepper song, Let's Talk About Sex, Baby. And we'll be bringing on our guests from the Student Wellness Center, Braylon Davis. But before we get started with that, Paris, why don't we go into today's Big Green Gremlin?
Sounds great. So we got this Big Green Gremlin from a listener this week who had the question of how is sex related to mental health?
Which I think is a great question.
It's a valid question.
Yeah. Well, so I'll share some of the things I first think of, and then maybe you can add to that, Paris.
Awesome.
But yeah, I think it's really inextricably linked, actually. When I think about even some of the diagnoses that we have, like depression and anxiety, specifically like depression, right? Thinking about anhedonia or not finding pleasure in things you used to find pleasure in. This can show up in sex really commonly when people don't have as much sexual desire or aren't enjoying their sexual activity in the same way they used to, not feeling desire to be as intimate with others. And it can also show up kind of not in the reverse. That's kind of what I'm thinking, but ways where one, like the trouble with sex is kind of the cause of the mental health concerns. If there's a lot of anxiety around sexual performance or around whether or not somebody is having sex, right? Like whatever that means to them, broadly defined, if that's not meeting their desire or their expectations, it might cause concerns for them as well. So those are some of the things that come up for me right away, but I'm curious for you, Paris, some of how you see sex and mental health being related.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely like to think about sexual activity, but about improving on those relationships, which ultimately benefits our mental health. So it's, creating that level of trust or intimacy that you might see in a significant relationship or moving forward with just friendships that have those benefits. It can increase that level. What about expressing emotions? That's a means of expression. And so I really think it's just one of those pieces that is going to be essential in how we improve. It's something that, like you mentioned, when it comes to depression and stuff, it might show up that way to where that sexual activity is not where you want it to be. I think it's huge.
Yeah, I think those are really great examples. And something that you said, I don't know what about it, but made me think of also the ways that kind of inequality, discrimination, marginalization can sometimes show up in relation to sex or people being sexualized. I think about like the orgasm gap, and that's typically between people like with vulvas compared to people with penises, and how that shows up in partnered sex versus solo sex or masturbation. I think about fetishization and how that can manifest for folks, and it kind of lead to further marginalization or discrimination. It can show up in lots of different ways. And I think all of those things are kind of both related to mental health and related to a person's experience of sex. And so lots of stuff to cover there. We won't get to all of this today, but I do think this is a topic that's really relevant to our work as mental health professionals. And I'm excited for us to talk with Braylon a little bit more about this and how sex and hookup culture and all of this what it looks like at Dartmouth, and what are some of the norms that we're looking to kind of build on here.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to this conversation too.
Yeah. So thank you for submitting this week's Big Green Gremlin. And remember, if there is something that you want to see talked about on a future episode of Thinks with Shrinks, DM us on Instagram or submit your questions and ideas on our website, dartgo.org/thinkswithshrinks.
So with that being said, let's bring on our guest, Braylon Davis.
Hey, Braylon, welcome to Thinks with Shrinks.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're so glad you're here, truly. So before we go about diving into our topic, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your position at the Student Wellness Center?
For sure. Well, my name is Braylon Davis. I use she, her, hers pronouns. A little bit about me and my background. I am from Indianapolis, Indiana. And I began working here at Dartmouth a little over a year and a half, with most of that time being in quarantine, obviously remote. That's been kind of fun. And I'm the Healthy Relationship Specialist at the Student Wellness Center. And a little bit more about that role. So basically, I'm a part of the Sexual Violence Prevention Project team, which is a 4-year curriculum around sexual violence prevention. And a lot of my work is centered around positive relationships and sexual experiences. So that is like a lot of what my programming and curriculum development is centered around. And I'm just super excited to be here. This job is really, really great and fun and not like any other position. So I'm super glad to be a part of this community.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we're glad to have you as a part of this Dartmouth community and definitely glad to have you with us today. And given what you kind of just described about your position, you were an obvious choice when we wanted to talk about sex and hookup culture on today's show. And so would love to hear from you. And I know your experience with students at Dartmouth is a little bit interesting given that it's been mostly in quarantine or mostly in the context of COVID, so mostly remote, but would love to hear from your work with students, from what you've heard from students, how would you describe hookup culture at Dartmouth? What does that mean?
Yeah. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to do a lot of programming as soon as I got here. So I had the opportunity to really have some of that student interaction face to face with programming. In particular, in 2019, 2020, winter 2020, I got to pilot a program called Relationship, Sex, and Alcohol, specifically within the Greek community. And that really allowed me to have candid conversations with students about hookup culture and about their experiences. And so one thing that I gained from that is that the term hookup is something that is wide. It has various definitions. It looks like many different things to different people. So that's one thing to think about. And then just thinking about, in general context, hooking up meaning just a casual sexual encounter. And so one thing that a lot of students mentioned about hookup culture here at Dartmouth is that it feels like it is something that everyone is doing. But in reality, like we may know, a lot of times we may kind of hyper emphasize something that may not be the norm. And so a lot of people may feel pressured to participate in hookup culture when in reality, not everyone and a lot of people aren't actually doing these things. And so it kind of makes you feel like you have to overcompensate or act in ways that maybe you're not as comfortable with. And then in context to some of the conversations that I had in that program with Greek members, was the context of, frat parties and the expectation and kind of setting of having alcohol and drinking games that kind of lead to those sexual encounters or hookups that maybe they weren't expecting or weren't as comfortable with. And so there feels like a certain type of pressure or expectation or setting that kind of helps with the hookup culture norm. And so that's something that a lot of people have mentioned, kind of wanting to talk about, think through, and kind of reshape some of the cultural norms around that. So that's a little bit about what I've learned about hookup culture here at Dartmouth.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. I think that's really useful.
Absolutely. And I think it also speaks to, what you learned before COVID, and getting that baseline and then seeing how it kind of transitions to, being in this pandemic now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What are some common concerns that students brought to you or that you've heard about related to sexual or dating intimacy?
Yeah, a lot of concerns are around creating friendships or relationships that are long lasting.
Yeah.
One, just being like the setting and the academic rigor and the D plan that kind of makes forming relationships kind of difficult. And so that could be, romantic or platonic. Um, the fact that you can meet someone and really be into them or really have a good time with them, and then they're gone for the next term or the next couple terms can be very difficult. And it kind of can formulate a mindset to kind of not get invested in others because you never really know how or when they're going to be in the space or how to make it work or if it feels worth it. So that is something that has been like a number one concern around forming dating intimacy or like sexual intimacy. Another thing that was brought up a lot was students talking about like sharing sexual experiences, and Dartmouth being such a small space, feeling like you kind of don't have some privacy when you are, maybe you did hook up with someone or you had a good night with a person and you share it with someone and then it kind of, goes around, and some of that that may not be the intention to kind of become gossipy or anything like that, but with such a small setting, sharing it with your teammates or sharing it with people in your house or your friends or, a classmate can kind of be, it can kind of limit the privacy to your own personal sex life or relationship. So I think that those are some of the main concerns. Yeah, and also just in general, I think right now, specifically with COVID, just a lack of opportunity to meet new people and to kind of take that step to either if you want to hook up with someone or have sex with someone, thinking about the different, factors to include now that we're in a pandemic.
Yeah.
And given the setting around having gatherings or having parties or any of that, thinking about the repercussions around that. So I think that that also is like a huge concern currently.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you touched on some really Dartmouth specific concerns there too, right? Well, thinking about how the D plan impacts that. And I hear so often about, I have so many students actually come in and will say something like, I'm just not going to date for my 4 years here. I'm not going to like get invested in anyone. And I'm like, good luck. Like I don't have that kind of control over my feelings.
And that can, that could be kind of like disheartening. You want people to have good experiences and not have to have that expectation in their brain that they won't find anyone or enjoy that type of experience.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I echo those concerns that you voiced. We're hearing some of that. I think you're probably hearing it more often given your role. But another concern that's come up for us in our roles when we were talking about this episode and preparing for it, we realized that a lot of our clients are asking, what is normal? Like it comes up in a lot of different ways. It might be like, what is the normal way to masturbate or frequency of masturbation? How often are people having sex when they're in committed relationships? What constitutes sex, right? Like similar to hookup, sex can be more broadly defined as well. Am I the only one not having sex? So lots of different questions around like what is normal. And I think for us, a lot of times our answer is some version of it depends, and we kind of explore it more individually. So I recognize this is a difficult question, but would love to hear any thoughts that you have or information you could provide to our listeners around what is normal, like what are the norms that exist?
Absolutely. And I love this question, and which is another reason why I really love this role that I have. Within the Student Wellness Center, we always want to come from like a human-centered, empathetic, very positive, inclusive, and empowering philosophy. So one thing that I always practice in all of my colleagues at the Student Wellness Center is kind of normalizing that what is normal is what feels right for you. And a lot of times we may feel like we have to know a certain number or a percentage, or am I average? Or, I think that that's what we kind of are constantly trying to chase the pursuit of being the average person or being a part of the normalcy. But I think that if we begin to kind of normalize your own experiences to what feels right for you, that's like the number one thing that we want to do. So this question, I think I want to emphasize that masturbation is normal, completely normal. I want to emphasize that having sex with your partner as frequently as you and your partner have communicated is normal. Making sure that it is consensual each time is what we really want to emphasize. So I don't have numbers or percentages, but there are some credible places where you can look those things up if that's what you're interested in looking into. I do want to say that, anytime there's research or studies or information that has been put out around these topics, they're usually surveyed by a certain group of people. And so we want to be mindful that these populations that they usually survey are not necessarily going to be representative of everyone. So I do want to emphasize that. But just to put some actual places that you can kind of look up those things if you really want to. One place that I usually look to is the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. That's my alma mater, which is a great resource. I also want to plug my intern, Olivia Goodwin at 21. We developed a Canvas site called Positive Relationships and Sex that all undergrad students have access to. So that's another place where you can kind of find some more information around specific questions like this. So hopefully that answers a little bit around that. So I really just want to emphasize, normal is what feels right for you. And that is what we want to empower people to recognize. It's okay if you're not having sex. It's okay if you are. And kind of taking the steps to kind of see what it is that you want.
Oh, we truly appreciate that response because, oftentimes I know I can get caught up in wanting just to have those statistics and make sure it fits what I'm, doing. But I think having more of that individual, like peace with, okay, this is what my experience is and I'm loving it for what it is and what it brings to me, and that be enough.
Yes.
That's great. So thank you.
Absolutely.
I also appreciate the shout out to Kinsey. Yeah,
absolutely.
Did a lot of research in one of my classes in undergrad about him. And so, yeah, that's a great institute, good resource. So as we're moving on, there are some challenges to intimacy while we're dealing with the pandemic, as you mentioned earlier. But, as we're starting to see that we're coming out to the other side of this and moving towards post-COVID, what do you anticipate may be some challenges for students as they start to engage in more physical intimacy?
Yeah, I think that one, just kind of getting back into the swing of being around more people, having more social interaction. And I know that a lot of students talk about the work hard, play hard mentality of Dartmouth culture. And so being mindful of that, like once everyone is kind of, tiptoeing back into some of the normalcy that we used to have, just being mindful of who and how you interact with one another, because I know that it can be super exciting. We feel like we kind of missed out on a year of fun and life. And I know myself included, we feel like we kind of got cheated of certain experiences. And so some people may want to kind of delve right into it. But I just want to emphasize, like I said earlier, doing what feels right for you. And sometimes that work hard, play hard mentality can kind of allow you to kind of take actions and behave in ways that aren't necessarily what you would typically do. So I do want to also say, still be in communication with whoever you are having sexual interactions with. or whoever you are becoming more intimate with, as far as the pandemic, if they're vaccinated, if they're taking precautions, talking about, how many sexual partners you may be having. And this is something to think of prior to COVID as well. But, really still thinking about that. I know that we're kind of coming out of the tunnel, but we still want to be mindful of some of that as well. Also emphasizing, masturbation and things like that. If you still want to continue to kind of lay low and not do that type of interaction, or online sexting, or, if you're a long distance, things like that. I think that is something to really still practice. I know that may be a little bit more heightened right now in the pandemic, but even post-COVID, still doing some of those safety precautions could be really, really helpful. Yeah, I think that's really.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's super helpful. And I like what you're saying too about there are some things that maybe have become heightened in the pandemic with having to be more remote or engaging in increased masturbation or things like that, when maybe partnered sex is less accessible or feels less safe. And I've learned, just kind of like remote work, there are things that we can take away of like, oh, this might be actually good for when we kind of go back to normal to continue some of these practices. Some of that from our sexual experiences or how we've navigated intimacy, romantic and sexual intimacy can be continued post-pandemic as well.
Absolutely.
So, all right, so there are so many different places that people are going to get information about sex, and we know some of them, like porn, are not always the most like realistic or useful. You've already mentioned a couple of resources, the Kinsey Institute, and then that Canvas site that you and Olivia Goodwin, your intern, created. And we'll make sure to link that Canvas site in our like episode notes so that people can check that out. Just wanted to give you the opportunity to recommend any other places that you send folks to learn more about sex. And please feel free to plug, again, any resources that you have that you'd like students to check out.
Absolutely. I think that I'm going to highlight the Canvas site again, because that is the place where we've kind of really centralized the resources outside of Dartmouth.
Awesome.
Including Dartmouth resources. So you can really find all of that there. And I really encourage everyone to take a look at that. We have also a feedback form on that Canvas site. So we would love for you all to, fill that out so that we can continue to grow the content around it. I also want to allow myself to be a resource. This is literally my job. So if anyone has questions or anything, you can email me at my Dartmouth email, which is braylon.c.davis@dartmouth.edu. Or you can also, go to the Student Wellness Center and ask any of our staff there, and they will get you to the right person. I would love to have one-on-one conversations with people around any of their concerns with relationships, sex, anything like that. I also want to plug the SVPP programming that we have, which is the first year experience, and we're us building out the sophomore year experience. And so relationship, sex, and alcohol, the program that I mentioned that I piloted last year, will be launching in a couple weeks virtually. So that will be going to all sophomores. So that is also another workshop that's specifically around relationship, sex, alcohol. Also, it really is a great resource around communication, emotional intelligence. So I'm super excited to roll that out. And then lastly, I want to plug the Dartmouth SWC Instagram, where you can find more stuff. That's Dartmouth SWC on Instagram. And
we'll definitely tag that when we post this on our Instagram page too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And YouTube. So that's Student Wellness Dartmouth on YouTube, where you can find also some other videos.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Obviously, you have been working hard. There are so many of those resources and now available remotely. So
yeah,
good work. Yeah. I know that's not easy.
Thank you.
Oh, we truly appreciate that. So thank you for sharing those resources. So, preparing for this episode, Alex was telling me about some resources that she had heard about, and pre-COVID, and just wanted to kind of talk to you to see if the safer sex bar is still an option for students. Can you tell us more about what it is, and if it is something that's still available, how students can access it?
Absolutely, which is something that the Student Wellness Center as a whole has been revamping. So due to COVID, before obviously we couldn't have our items or our safer sex supplies available because our office was closed. However, we are working on having satellite safer sex bars within certain house communities, as well as the Cube with Onion. So that is to come, and possibly even just a general wellness goodie bag. So that is something that we hope to roll out in the spring term.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Keep your eyes out.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of this information. I know if the listeners are anything like me, they will be like racing to go meet you in your, or, arrange meetings with you, go to that Canvas site, learn all of the things, because to me, this topic, sex, romantic relationships, like all of that is such a big part of our lives, and is for me really fun to talk about, and really, really an exciting topic. So I really appreciate your knowledge and expertise and information that you've shared with us today. As we come to the end of our episode, one of the things that we like to do with our guest interviews is to kind of do a callback to our tagline, which is "You can do hard things." And so it would be great if you could share with us maybe a hard thing that you can do, a hidden talent you have, or a fun fact about yourself.
Yes, I thought about this question and I was like, okay, I think I have like a 2-part answer.
Yes.
So there's a hard thing that relates to what I do, my work, my passion, and then like a fun fact. Okay.
Awesome.
So, one hard thing that I think that I'm, super, I don't know, excited and passionate about is just empathizing with one another, and listening to others, and kind of being a part of human connection, and not just kind of moving through life thinking of people as objects. So I think that it's important just to kind of really practice empathy. And I think that's a hard thing that a lot of people don't think about as much. So I think that that's one part of my answer that's kind of centered around why I do what I do. And then another fun fact is that I make shea butter whip for skincare.
Oh.
That's really fun. I love to do that on the side.
That's awesome. Is this like available for purchase?
I did have an Etsy shop, but I'm gonna revamp it. But yeah, that's something that I do. I don't know if it's necessarily hard. It's just a fun thing that I like to do.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll be in touch. Hit you up after this.
Great.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Braylon, for joining us today. I so appreciate everything that you are able to offer to us and to our listeners today in terms of your knowledge and expertise.
Yes, it was such a pleasure to have you here for this episode.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, that's our episode for today, everyone. So we hope you join us next time.
And until then, remember that you can do hard things.